It was on a particularly cold and fog-laden evening in late autumn that I found myself seated comfortably before the hearth at 221B Baker Street, a book in one hand and a glass of brandy in the other. The gas lamps outside flickered weakly against the oppressive mist that had settled over London, turning the city into a shadowed and indistinct realm. Within our sitting room, however, all was warmth and familiarity. Holmes, ever the embodiment of restless intellect, was stretched across his armchair, his long, sinewy fingers absently plucking at the strings of his violin. His eyes, half-lidded, betrayed the peculiar state of semi-engagement that often preceded his most lucid deductions. There were no clients that evening, nor any immediate cases to occupy him, and I suspected that he was merely awaiting the arrival of some fresh intrigue with that curious patience which often unnerved me. "A singular atmosphere tonight, Watson," he remarked suddenly, his bow lingering upon the strings. "One can almost sense that the city itself is holding its breath." I smiled at his dramatics. "Or merely suffering from an excess of industrial smoke," I replied, taking another sip of my drink. Holmes smirked but said nothing. He allowed the violin to rest against his knee and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. The fire crackled between us, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill beyond the window panes. It was an evening that might have passed in comfortable quiet, had it not been for the peculiar turn of events that soon disrupted our peace. Little did we know, a mystery was about to unfold that would test Holmes's formidable intellect in ways neither of us could anticipate. It was I who first broke the silence. My attention had wandered from my book, drawn instead to the day's edition of the Times, which lay folded upon the side table. Idly, I retrieved it and let my gaze skim the headlines, expecting to find the usual reports of Parliament debates, political upheavals, or the occasional scandal among the aristocracy. However, my eyes soon fell upon a headline that startled me into full alertness. Renowned opera soprano Irina Vassiliev mysteriously disappears mid-performance. I sat upright, adjusting my spectacles, and read aloud the brief but astonishing article. It described how Miss Vassiliev, a celebrated soprano of Russian descent, had vanished from the stage of the Royal Opera House in the midst of an aria, leaving the audience and orchestra in bewilderment. The curtains had briefly fallen for a scene change, and when they lifted again, she was gone, with no sign of struggle, no witnesses, and no apparent means of escape. Holmes, who had been gazing into the fire, turned his head slightly at the mention of the disappearance. His sharp grey eyes flickered with the faintest glint of interest. "Curious," he murmured. "A woman does not simply cease to exist, particularly not under such public scrutiny." I watched as he extended his hand. Without a word, I passed him the paper, and he studied it intently. I had seen that expression before. It was the look of a mind already shifting into motion. "This," he declared at last, "has the markings of an impossible crime. And an impossible crime, Watson, is merely a puzzle awaiting the proper mind to solve it." I leaned forward. "But how could such a thing be possible, Holmes?" "The Royal Opera House is no magician's theatre. There are no hidden trapdoors or illusions designed to fool an audience." Holmes was silent for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the arm of his chair. Then, without warning, he rose and strode toward the bookshelf, retrieving a volume on the architectural history of London's theatres. "We must consider every possibility," he said as he flipped through the pages. "If the lady did not leave through conventional means, then we must ask, what unconventional means were at her disposal?" I shook my head. The article states that there were no signs of struggle, no one saw her leave, and yet she was there one moment and gone the next. It defies all logic. Holmes's lips curled slightly. "On the contrary, Watson, it follows a logic we have yet to perceive." I frowned, unsettled by the confidence in his tone. Holmes was never one to accept impossibilities, and I suspected that he already had a dozen theories forming in that keen mind of his. At that precise moment, a sharp knock at the door shattered the stillness of the room. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Visitors at such an hour often heralded the arrival of a mystery worth our attention. and we were not to be disappointed. The knock at the door was urgent, its sharpness cutting through the quiet of our rooms with a force that made me set down my brandy at once. Holmes, ever composed, merely cast a glance at me before calling out for Mrs. Hudson to admit our visitor. A moment later, Sir Reginald Ashworth strode into the sitting room, his tall frame draped in a heavy cloak, his face lined with worry. He removed his hat with a trembling hand, his eyes darting about the room before settling upon Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, you must assist me," he said, his voice edged with desperation. "London is on the verge of a scandal, the likes of which the Opera House may never recover from." Holmes, who had remained motionless in his chair, now studied the man before him with that unwavering gaze that so often unnerved his clients. "Sir Reginald Ashworth," he murmured, "patron of the Royal Opera House, a man who is not easily disturbed, and yet you seem quite beside yourself. Sit, sir, and tell me everything." Ashworth obeyed, though he perched on the edge of the chair as if ready to spring to his feet at any moment. "Irina Vassiliev," he said, "our finest soprano, gone, vanished into thin air before an audience of hundreds. You have read the papers?" "I have," Holmes replied, "and the account was most unsatisfactory." "Then you understand why I have come. This is no mere disappearance, Mr. Holmes. Something darker is at play. Irina feared she was being watched, and now she is simply gone." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Interesting," he said at last. "Tell me everything you know." Sir Reginald exhaled deeply, as though unburdening himself of a great weight. "Irina arrived in London 3 years ago," he began. "A voice like hers is a rarity, pure, commanding, and unforgettable. The audiences adored her, and soon she was the star of the Opera House. But she carried a certain melancholy, a shadow that never quite left her eyes." Holmes nodded, but did not interrupt. "I learned, through quiet inquiries, that she was of Russian birth, though she spoke little of her past. She claimed to have left that life behind her, but—" He hesitated. "But she feared something, or someone," Holmes supplied. "Precisely. Irina was a woman of great composure, but in the last few weeks I noticed a change. She grew anxious, withdrawn. She spoke of a presence, a figure she glimpsed outside the opera house lurking in the dark. She would arrive at rehearsals with dark circles beneath her eyes, as though she had not slept. And yet, she confided in no one." Ashworth shook his head. "She was too proud for that. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, she did not simply flee. She would never abandon the stage. Something happened to her, and I must know what." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then, with the faintest of smiles, he reached for his coat. Holmes rose, fastening the buttons of his coat with swift precision. "You present an impossible mystery, Sir Reginald," he said. "And that, of course, is the only kind worth pursuing." Watson, accustomed to his friend's ways, was already reaching for his own hat and cane. "And where do we begin?" I asked. Holmes retrieved his gloves and turned to me with an expression of quiet amusement. "Where all great performances begin, my dear Watson. The stage." With that, we stepped out into the fog-laden streets of London, bound for the Royal Opera House and the mystery that awaited within its gilded halls. We arrived at the Royal Opera House under the cover of darkness, the city's gas lamps casting dim pools of light upon the damp streets. The great building loomed before us, its ornate facade shrouded in shadow, as though the very walls conspired to keep their secrets hidden. Holmes rapped sharply upon the side entrance, and after a moment's hesitation, a nervous doorman admitted us, leading us swiftly through the deserted corridors. The grandeur of the place, even in darkness, was undeniable. The sweeping marble staircases, the towering chandeliers that lay dormant above us, and the heavy crimson curtains that framed the great stage. Yet there was a certain hollowness about the air, an unsettling silence where music should have been. "Tell me, Watson," Holmes murmured as we moved towards the stage. "What is it that truly makes a disappearance impossible?" I considered the question. "The absence of means," I said. "A locked door, a guarded exit, an uninterrupted audience. If all avenues are accounted for, escape becomes unthinkable. Holmes gave a small, approving nod. And yet, unthinkable or not, it has occurred. We stepped onto the stage, where the boards creaked softly beneath our feet. Holmes's keen eyes moved swiftly over the scene before him, searching for some imperceptible clue that had eluded all others. "Let us begin," he said, "and let us assume nothing." At that moment, a door at the far end of the stage opened, and a figure emerged, a thin, sharp-featured man with a furrowed brow, his face lined with sleepless worry. "Mr. Collier, I presume," Holmes called. "The stage manager?" The man hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Aye," he said hoarsely. "And if you're here about Miss Vassiliev, I'll tell you the same thing I told the police. She didn't leave that stage." Mr. Collier folded his arms, his expression grim. "I don't expect you to believe me, Mr. Holmes, but I tell you, no one left that stage unseen." Holmes regarded him coolly. "That is an extraordinary claim," he said. "Explain." The stage manager exhaled heavily. "I was standing right there, just off the wings," he said, gesturing to the dimly lit space beyond the curtain. "She was singing the aria from La Traviata, and then the scene changed. The curtain dropped for a moment, a breath no more, and when it lifted," his fingers clenched at his sleeves, "she was gone." Holmes's gaze swept across the stage. The set. Was there any means for her to conceal herself within it? Collier shook his head firmly. "We checked every inch of it. No doors, no hidden compartments." The stagehands swore they saw nothing unusual. Holmes crouched and ran his fingers lightly along the wooden floorboards. "And the trapdoor?" "Locked," Collier said. "Not used in that scene, nor for any part of the performance." Holmes straightened and clasped his hands behind his back. "Then, Mr. Collier, what is your explanation?" The man hesitated. "I don't have one," he admitted, lowering his voice. "But I tell you, sir, she didn't leave that stage by any natural means." Holmes turned sharply to him. "Natural means?" Collier's throat bobbed. "There are stories, Mr. Holmes, old stories. This theatre, it's seen its share of misfortune. Some say it's haunted." Watson, ever the rationalist, scoffed, but Holmes merely regarded the man with keen interest. "Haunted, you say?" he murmured. "How very intriguing." Leaving the stage behind, Holmes and I were escorted through the corridors of the performers' dressing rooms, where the scent of powder and lingering perfume mixed with the stale air. A small cluster of opera singers and stagehands had gathered, their voices hushed, their eyes darting about as though fearful of speaking too loudly. A pale, nervous woman, Miss Eleanor Gray, a fellow soprano, stepped forward. "It was the whispers," she said, gripping her shawl tightly. "She heard them first." Holmes turned to her. "Whispers?" The woman nodded. "Irina spoke of them often. She said someone, or something, was outside her dressing room at night." I frowned. "And did anyone else hear these whispers?" A murmur passed through the group. "Some of us did," another woman admitted hesitantly. "A soft voice, just beyond the door. But when we opened it, no one was there." Holmes glanced at me, a flicker of amusement in his expression. He knelt by the floor, pressing his palm against the wooden panels. Then, rising swiftly, he stepped towards Irina's dressing table, his eyes scanning the mirror, the scattered cosmetic jars, the embroidered shawl draped over the chair. "And what did Miss been here longer than most, and I seen things." "What kind of things?" He glanced over his shoulder before answering. "Shadows, sir, up in the rafters, just before the girl disappeared." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Shadows?" "Aye," Tom muttered. "Something was moving up there, a shape, like a man, but it weren't a man. I tell ye, this place has seen its share of strange goings-on." I folded my arms. "You believe the theatre to be haunted?" Tom sniffed. "I believe in what I see, Doctor. And I saw something unnatural up there that night." Holmes was silent for a moment, Then he stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Tell me, old Tom, were you the only one who saw this shadow?" The old man hesitated, then nodded. Holmes turned to me, his grey eyes gleaming with interest. "I believe, Watson, that we must pay a visit to the rafters." We left the dressing rooms behind and returned to the stage, where Holmes immediately knelt to inspect the wooden floorboards beneath the great set-piece from which Irina had vanished. He ran his hands along the seams, pressing lightly in various places. "The trapdoor," I muttered. "Surely it was checked." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "And yet, it remains a curiosity." He gestured to Collier, the stage manager, who reluctantly approached. "You are certain it was not in use?" "As certain as I can be," the man insisted. "That mechanism hasn't been engaged in months." Holmes withdrew a small magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the edges of the trapdoor. "Curious," he murmured. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I crouched beside him, peering at the floor. At first, I saw nothing of interest, until I noticed a faint scrape along the edge of the panel. "Someone has tampered with it," I said. "Indeed," Holmes mused, "and yet it was not engaged." Collier shook his head. "I don't see how this helps." Holmes dusted off his hands and stood. "It tells us one very important thing," he said. "Whoever made Irina disappear wanted us to believe she fell through this trapdoor, but she did not." The stage manager paled. "Then how, Mr. Holmes?" he whispered. "Did she vanish?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That, my dear sir, is the question." Holmes and I stepped into Irina Vassiliev's dressing room, a small but elegant space now eerily abandoned. The scent of perfume still lingered in the air, as if she had only just left. Holmes's keen eyes swept the room before settling upon the single window, its latch unfastened. He moved to it swiftly, pushing it open and peering out into the dark alley below. "Interesting," he murmured. I joined him at the window. The alley was narrow, hemmed in by tall, soot-streaked buildings, with no visible means of escape, no footprints in the dirt, no overturned crates, no disturbance of any kind. Holmes drew his head back inside, fingers tapping lightly against the sill. "Tell me, Watson, what do you observe?" I considered the scene carefully. The window was left open, which suggests either a hurried exit or a deliberate misdirection. But given the lack of any sign below, I hesitated. "She cannot have left this way." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, and yet the open window was not left so without reason. It tells us something." "And what is that?" Holmes turned, his sharp gaze scanning the room once more. "That we are meant to believe she did." Holmes moved away from the window, his eyes sweeping the room with renewed intensity. After a moment, he paused before the large dressing mirror, his fingers running lightly along its carved frame. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, he reached behind it and withdrew a tiny scrap of black silk. For the first time that evening, I saw his expression darken. He turned the fabric over in his hands, his thumb tracing its delicate weave. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is no ordinary fabric. This," he held it up to the dim light, "belongs to a very particular kind of cloak." "And what does that mean?" Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "It means, my dear Watson," he murmured, "that this case is far more dangerous than I had anticipated." As we left the Royal Opera House, the case weighed heavily upon my mind. The facts were as clear as they were impossible. A woman had vanished in plain sight, before an audience of hundreds, with no trace of where she had gone. The dressing room window, the trapdoor, the whispers in the night, each clue only deepened the mystery rather than dispelling it. Holmes strode purposefully through the dimly lit streets, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his coat, his gaze fixed upon some unseen horizon of thought. I, however, could not contain my exasperation. "Holmes," I said at last, "this is sheer madness. A stage manager who swears she did not leave, an alley without footprints, and now an opera house full of people whispering about ghosts. Holmes did not break stride. "And what conclusion do you draw from that, Watson?" "That there is no conclusion to be drawn," I exclaimed. "How can we reason through what is, by all logic, an impossibility?" Holmes finally halted and turned to me, his sharp eyes glittering in the dim gaslight. "You mistake the nature of the problem, my dear fellow. Irina Vassiliev did not vanish into thin air, but perhaps she disappeared into shadows." I stared at him. "Shadows?" "Indeed. You assume, Watson, that she is gone. But what if the better question is, not where she went, but who took her?" Before I could press him further, Holmes quickened his pace, heading toward our waiting cab. "Come, Watson, there is a man we must find, a man I suspect has been lurking just beyond the edge of our vision." Holmes wasted no time in securing information about the days leading up to Irina's disappearance. By late afternoon, we had visited a handful of establishments where the opera singer was known to frequent. It was at a modest tea shop near Covent Garden that our first true lead emerged. "Miss Vassiliev?" The shopkeeper, a portly woman with keen eyes, said thoughtfully. "Aye, she came in just last week. Not her usual self, though. Seemed troubled." "In what way?" Holmes pressed. The woman lowered her voice. "She was meeting a gentleman, tall, dark-haired, foreign-looking. They sat in the far corner, whispering. I didn't like the look of him." Holmes leaned forward. "And why is that?" The shopkeeper hesitated. "Because she looked afraid of him." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Did you overhear anything?" "Only a word or two. He called her Katya, and she flinched when he did." Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Katya," he murmured. "Interesting. And what of the gentleman? Have you seen him before?" The woman shook her head. "No, sir, but I'd wager a guinea he wasn't here for a pleasant reunion." Holmes straightened. "Thank you, madam. You have been most helpful." As we stepped outside, I turned to Holmes. "Katya. That is not her name." "It is not the name she gave London," Holmes corrected. "But it may well be the name she fled from." Determined to learn more, we made our way to Irina's lodgings, a modest apartment not far from the opera house. The landlady, a frail woman with a suspicious air, was reluctant to allow us entry, but a sharp remark from Holmes regarding the presence of the authorities swiftly softened her resolve. "I don't know what's become of her," the woman muttered as she led us inside. "But if you ask me, it was only a matter of time before her past caught up with her." Holmes cast her a sidelong glance. "Her past, you say?" The landlady nodded. "She used to get letters from someone in the old country. Never answered 'em, just threw 'em straight into the fire. But not before I saw her hands shake whenever she read 'em." Holmes stopped in the doorway of the sitting room, his gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings. Then, without hesitation, he moved to a small writing desk, pulling open the drawers with methodical precision. Within moments, he retrieved a bundle of letters, carefully tucked behind a stack of sheet music. He unfolded one, his eyes flicking across the lines. The writing was in Russian. Holmes handed it to me. "You read Cyrillic, Watson?" I shook my head. "Then we shall have to make use of a translator," he said. "But even without knowing the words, the meaning is clear enough." He held up the envelope, tapping a finger against the sender's name. "It seems, Watson, that Miss Vassiliev was not merely running from a man," he said softly. "She was running from an entire country." Holmes had often remarked upon the revelatory nature of banking records, and in this instance they provided a lead of considerable significance. A brief inquiry at Irina Vassiliev's financial institution uncovered a curious fact. On the day before her disappearance, she had withdrawn a substantial sum of money, an amount far beyond what would be necessary for ordinary expenses. The clerk, a bespectacled young man of precise manner, glanced between Holmes and myself with visible unease. "Miss Vassiliev was in great haste," he said. "She arrived just before closing, refused all pleasantries, and insisted on withdrawing the entire amount in banknotes." Holmes accepted the information without reaction. And did she give any indication as to why she required such a sum? The clerk shook his head. She said little, save that she would not return. I started. She said that? Not in those exact words, sir, the man clarified, adjusting his glasses. But she made it quite clear that she did not expect to need her account any longer. Holmes tapped his fingers against the counter, deep in thought. And she left, alone. The clerk hesitated. I believe there was a carriage waiting for her. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. That will do. My thanks, sir. As we stepped back onto the busy street, I turned to my companion. This is it, Holmes. Evidence that she meant to flee. Holmes merely gave me a sidelong glance. Is it, Watson? He mused. Or is it evidence that someone else knew she intended to? I frowned. You suspect she never reached that carriage? Holmes smiled faintly. I suspect, he murmured, that we must first determine whom she was paying. Our next destination was a fabric merchant of considerable reputation, one whom Holmes had encountered before in past investigations. The establishment catered to an exclusive clientele, dealing in silks, velvets, and textiles of such quality that only the wealthiest patrons could afford them. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a keen eye for detail, peered at the scrap of black silk that Holmes placed before him. He lifted it delicately, rubbing it between his fingers before nodding to himself. Exceptional quality, he murmured. This is no ordinary cloth, gentlemen. It is hand-woven silk, imported from the East, dyed using a method that only a handful of master weavers still practice. And its buyers? Holmes inquired. The merchant placed the silk down carefully. This fabric is used exclusively in the making of ceremonial cloaks, the sort worn by men of rank, particularly those of Russian nobility. I glanced at Holmes sharply. Then it is connected to our mysterious gentleman at the tea shop, the one who called her Katya. Holmes did not reply immediately, his fingers resting lightly on the counter. And tell me, my good man, he continued, would such a cloak be available to any who could afford it, or only to a select clientele? The merchant gave a thin smile. Such garments are not purchased over the counter, Mr. Holmes. They are commissioned. Each is custom-made, its materials carefully recorded. In short, they are as distinctive as a signature. Holmes tapped the silk fragment thoughtfully. And if I were to inquire as to recent clients? The merchant's expression turned wary. That, sir, is privileged information. Holmes slipped a visiting card across the counter. Then let us assume that discretion must sometimes yield to necessity. Should any of your esteemed patrons have foreign interests, I trust you shall consider where your duty lies. The man hesitated, then sighed. There was one recent order of note, he admitted reluctantly. A Count Victor Orloff, an envoy of sorts. He took great pains to have his cloak made in time for his arrival in London. Holmes met my gaze. Victor Orloff, he repeated. A name I rather think we shall be hearing again. As we stepped out into the night, the air had grown colder, the mist rising from the Thames like a curtain being drawn over the city. Holmes glanced upward as if addressing the stars. The pieces align, Watson, he murmured, and yet the picture they form remains obscured. Then what do we do next? Holmes straightened his coat. Why, my dear fellow, he said with quiet satisfaction, we pay a visit to a count. It was well past dusk when Holmes and I arrived at Irina Vassiliev's lodgings, a modest yet respectable establishment tucked away in a quiet street off the Strand. The landlady, a severe woman with a perpetual frown, eyed us warily as Holmes introduced himself. You're the second one asking after her, she muttered, arms crossed. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Indeed. And who was the first? She hesitated before answering. A man. Eastern European, I'd wager. Tall, dark-haired, and with a way about him that set my teeth on edge. Holmes's expression sharpened. When did this man appear? The woman sniffed. He was lurking about the place for a week before she vanished. Never came inside, mind you. Just waited. Always in the shadows, watching her window. Once, I caught him trying the door handle. When I asked his business, he only smiled and said he was an old friend come to see Katya. Holmes turned sharply. Katya, you say? Aye, she nodded. That's the name he used. But she told me more than once that no one called her that anymore. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. The name again, Katya, the same one we had heard at the tea shop. Holmes steepled his fingers in thought. And Miss Vasiliev, did she ever acknowledge his presence? The landlady's lips pursed. She knew he was there. You could see it in her face. But she never spoke of it, never asked for help. Then one evening, she came home pale as a ghost, locked her door tight. After that, she hardly slept. Holmes nodded as if some unseen puzzle piece had just fallen into place. You have been most helpful, madam. If you recall anything else, kindly send word to 221B Baker Street. As we stepped out into the cool night air, I turned to my companion. Holmes, this man, he must be the same one who met her at the tea shop. The same one who called her Katya. Holmes gave a faint smile. It appears, Watson, that Miss Vasiliev was being pursued by more than just an admirer, and if my suspicions are correct, we shall require the assistance of one particular man who deals in such matters. We returned to Baker Street without delay, Holmes retreating at once to his writing desk. With swift, deliberate strokes, he drafted a telegram to Mycroft Holmes, his elder brother, whose influence within the British government extended into corridors unseen by ordinary men. As he wrote, I leaned against the mantelpiece, watching him with curiosity. Holmes, what do you suspect? This man, the one following Irina. Who is he? Holmes did not glance up. That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question Mycroft shall answer. I frowned. You believe this is a matter of international concern? Holmes sealed the telegram with a decisive movement. Irina Vasiliev, or rather Katya, was not merely an opera singer fleeing an unhappy past. She was running from something far greater, a force with reach, influence, and no small degree of patience. The presence of an Eastern European agent, the nature of the silk cloak, the coded letters, each thread points toward a singular conclusion. He rose, handing me the slip of paper. Take this to the telegraph office at once. Mycroft's reply shall determine our next move. I unfolded the message and read. 2. Mycroft Holmes, Whitehall urgent inquiry regarding one Count Victor Orloff, recently arrived in London. Suspected involvement with missing Russian opera singer Irina Vasiliev. Any records of diplomatic ties or covert activity requested. Response needed immediately. S.H. I looked up. You believe Orloff is more than just a former suitor. Holmes smiled thinly. A diplomat does not pursue a woman across borders merely for love, Watson. If Orloff has come to London in search of Irina, then he has done so under orders. I left at once for the telegraph office, my mind turning over Holmes' words. If Mycroft possessed knowledge of Orloff, then we were not merely dealing with a missing persons case. We were stepping into the shadowed world of political intrigue, one in which disappearances were rarely accidents. Upon my return, I found Holmes standing by the window, gazing out into the fog-laden street. He turned at my entrance. Well, Watson, the message has been sent. When shall we expect a reply? Holmes retrieved his watch from his pocket. Mycroft, for all his indolence, is a man of efficiency. I expect a response within the hour. And so we waited. The fire crackled in the hearth, the clock ticked steadily, and outside, London continued in its ceaseless murmur. But I could not shake the feeling that with every passing minute, the noose around Irina Vasiliev was tightening. Then, just as the clock struck 11, a sharp knock came at the door. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. Ah, he murmured, that will be our answer. Holmes had often spoken of the criminal mind's greatest weakness, its inability to resist a challenge. It was upon this principle that he now acted, devising a trap that would force our unseen adversary into the open. That morning, with an air of casual indifference, Holmes sent a note to the editor of the Times, ensuring that by midday, an intriguing piece of information would circulate amongst those with a vested interest in Irina Vassiliev's fate. The article read, "A previously overlooked letter has been discovered among the missing soprano's belongings. Though its contents remain unknown, it is believed to hold key information regarding her sudden disappearance. Scotland Yard is said to be examining the matter closely." As he tossed aside the paper, Holmes turned to me with a satisfied expression. "And now, Watson, we wait. Do you truly believe this will provoke a reaction? My dear fellow, if there is indeed a man in London who wishes Irina to remain missing, he will find this news most distressing." Holmes had already arranged for the false information to reach every quarter where such whispers travel swiftly, from the dimly lit corridors of gentlemen's clubs to the back rooms of embassies. Within hours, we received confirmation that a foreign agent had made inquiries regarding the letter, his urgency unmistakable. Holmes merely smiled at the news. "Our shadow has taken the bait," he murmured. "Now, Watson, we shall see who steps into the light." That night, under the veil of London's ever-present fog, we took our places at a carefully chosen street corner, one where a watcher might reveal himself. The street where we had stationed ourselves was quiet, unremarkable, and for that very reason perfect for our purposes. Holmes had deduced that any man desperate to recover Irina's supposed letter would attempt to trace its whereabouts, and in doing so, he would lead himself straight to us. For over an hour, we waited. The gas lamps flickered weakly, casting shifting patterns upon the damp cobblestones. Footsteps echoed distantly, but none slowed in hesitation, until, at last, Holmes gave a slight inclination of his head. "There," he whispered. A tall figure, wrapped in a black silk cloak, had emerged at the far end of the street. He did not walk with the casual pace of a man at ease, but rather with the deliberate slowness of one who watches before he acts. Holmes observed him keenly. "Note the posture, Watson. This is a man accustomed to secrecy, yet not to fear. He follows because he believes himself the hunter, not the prey." "And yet," I murmured, "he does not know that the reverse is true." The man paused beneath a street lamp, the weak glow illuminating a sharp, angular face, his features partially obscured by the collar of his cloak. He stood for a moment, then took a slow step forward. Holmes turned to me. "Now, Watson, the time has come for our introduction." And with that, he stepped into the light. The man in the cloak stiffened as Holmes approached, his hand moving instinctively to his coat, perhaps to where a concealed weapon might rest. But Holmes raised a single hand, a disarming gesture that gave the stranger pause. "There is no need for theatrics, Count Orloff," he said smoothly. "We have much to discuss." The name struck me at once. Count Victor Orloff, the name given to us by the fabric merchant. For a moment, the Count neither moved nor spoke. Then, with a slow, measured exhale, he straightened, lowering his hand. "I expected no less," he murmured. "Sherlock Holmes." Holmes smiled. "Then I am pleased to have lived up to expectation. You have gone to great lengths to avoid notice, and yet here you are. That suggests one of two things. Either your mission has become desperate, or your opponent has become inconvenient. Which is it, I wonder?" The Count studied him carefully before allowing the faintest hint of amusement to touch his lips. "Perhaps both." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "Let us dispense with pretenses, Count. You are no ordinary traveller. Your presence in London was noted long before you took an interest in Irina Vassiliev." At her name, a shadow passed over Orloff's features. "Where is she?" Holmes tilted his head. "Ah, so you do not know. That is most enlightening." Orloff's jaw tightened. "I have come for her, Mr. Holmes. That is my only interest." And yet, Miss Vasilyev does not wish to be found, Holmes countered. Or rather, not by you. The Count's expression darkened, and for a moment I believed he might strike out in anger, but instead, he inhaled slowly. You do not understand, Mr. Holmes, he said softly. She is not merely a singer. She is not merely a woman who ran from a suitor. Holmes's gaze did not waver. Number. She is a woman who ran from a fate imposed upon her, a fate that required her silence. Orloff's grip tightened around his cloak. She was a fool to think she could escape it. Holmes smiled faintly. And yet, here you are, searching still. It seems, Count, that the fool was not hers to be made. For the first time, Orloff's composure faltered. Holmes had struck at something buried beneath his carefully crafted demeanor, something personal. And in that moment, I knew with certainty, Count Orloff was not here to kill Irina Vasilyev. He was here to save her. For a long moment, there was silence between Holmes and Count Orloff. The weight of the detective's final remark lingered in the air, unspoken, yet undeniable. The Count, whose rigid composure had withstood every inquiry thus far, exhaled and glanced away, as though resigned to a truth he had sought to conceal. Very well, Mr. Holmes, he said at last. If you have deduced so much, then there is little point in continuing this game of shadows. I shall tell you the truth, though I doubt it shall aid you in finding her. Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly. Pray, continue. Orloff's voice was measured, yet beneath it lay something that could have been regret. Irina Vasilyev was not merely an opera singer, he admitted. She was an exile, one whose voice carried more than melody. I started at his words. An exile? From what? The Count's lips pressed into a thin line. From a cause that could not afford to be forgotten. You see, Doctor, she did not flee Russia for personal reasons, nor was she some poor woman escaping a cruel suitor. She was a messenger, a woman whose very presence upon the stage was a signal to those who watched for it. Holmes gave a satisfied nod. Coded messages, hidden within her performances, no doubt. The shifting of a note, the emphasis of a phrase, trivial to the casual listener, but unmistakable to those awaiting her word. Orloff met his gaze. Precisely. A chill ran down my spine. And what was the nature of these messages? Orloff hesitated before answering. Rebellion. Names, locations. Plans for those who sought to overthrow the old order. Every note she sang carried meaning for those who had been watching. The authorities knew of her past, but they never suspected how deeply she remained involved. Holmes folded his arms. But you did, Count, which is why you pursued her across Europe. Orloff's eyes darkened. I was sent to retrieve her, yes, but I was not the only one searching. And that, Mr. Holmes, is why I fear that Irina Vasilyev has already met a fate far worse than exile. Holmes's expression did not change, though I could see the sharp gleam of understanding in his eyes. Tell me, Count, who else was searching for her? Orloff's gaze did not waver. Men far less patient than I, he said simply. Men who do not ask questions before they act. The Tsar's agents, Mr. Holmes. The secret police. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Then you were not here merely as a former diplomat. Orloff's mouth tightened. I was given an order. Bring her back to Russia, willingly or otherwise. Holmes did not seem surprised. And yet, you were not the one who made her disappear. The Count let out a slow breath. Number Y had planned my approach carefully. I had watched her for weeks, waiting for the moment she would see reason. I had no intention of harming her, Mr. Holmes. I came to London not as a hunter, but as a lifeline. Holmes nodded. And yet someone moved before you could. Orloff's jaw clenched. Yes, that is why I knew something had gone terribly wrong. Irina was no fool. She would never have walked into the hands of those who sought her destruction. If she vanished, it was because someone forced her to. Holmes considered this for a moment, then turned to me. Watson, what do we know of Sir Reginald Ashworth? I frowned. The patron of the Opera House? A wealthy man with a reputation for discretion. He brought the case to you himself. Indeed, Holmes murmured. And yet, it was his opera house where Irina performed, where she vanished without a trace. It was his interests that would suffer should scandal arise. And it was he who first suggested that she had been taken rather than fled. Orloff stiffened. You believe Ashworth had a hand in this? Holmes smiled faintly. Count, when a woman is pursued by two forces and she vanishes, one must ask, who stood to benefit from both parties being left empty-handed? The Russian exhaled sharply. Then if you are right, she is still in London. Holmes reached for his coat. Then we have no time to lose. Gentlemen, we must return to the Opera House. The evening air had turned bitterly cold as we hurried back toward Baker Street, Count Orloff at our side. Holmes, deep in thought, had spoken little, his long strides carrying him forward with the singular determination that I had come to recognize as the herald of an imminent revelation. It was as we turned onto Oxford Street that he finally broke his silence. The key, Watson, he murmured, lies in motive. Who would benefit most from Irina's disappearance? The Russian authorities, I answered at once. Orloff's superiors wished to reclaim her. Holmes nodded, but did not slow his pace. And yet Orloff did not take her, nor did the secret police, which leaves us with a most intriguing question. Who moved before them? I hesitated. You suspect someone outside this political intrigue. Not outside, he corrected. Merely someone with an entirely different set of interests. Orloff exhaled sharply. If not my countrymen, then who? Holmes stopped abruptly beneath a street lamp. Sir Reginald Ashworth, he said. I started. Ashworth? The very man who engaged us in this investigation. Holmes smiled faintly. You are surprised, Watson. And yet, think, was it not he who first set this mystery before us? He came to us not because he wished for Irina's return, but because he wished to control the story. Orloff's jaw tightened. You mean to say he knew? He knew enough, Holmes confirmed. He learned that his prize soprano was not merely a performer, but a courier for a revolutionary cause. And what would happen should that scandal become public? Ashworth is no fool. His empire, his reputation, his carefully cultivated influence, all would crumble. No investor, no patron would align themselves with a man whose theatre harboured treasonous activity. I felt a chill run through me. Then he took matters into his own hands. Precisely, Holmes said. Before the Russians could act, before Irina herself could flee, he removed her from the equation. Orloff's fists clenched. Then where is she? Holmes's eyes darkened. That, my dear Count, is the final piece of this puzzle, and I believe I know where to find her. We arrived at the Royal Opera House well past midnight, the city shrouded in silence save for the distant clip of hooves on cobblestone. Holmes, unerring in his certainty, led the way inside, where a single gas lamp still flickered dimly in the manager's office. Collier, the stage manager, started as we entered. Mr. Holmes, what on earth? There is no time for explanations, Holmes cut in. You are familiar with the tunnels beneath the theatre. The man paled. Good heavens, you cannot mean... But I do, Holmes said coolly. The old passageways, the storage vaults, the rooms long abandoned and forgotten beneath this very stage. Tell me, Collier, did Sir Reginald ever mention them to you? Collier swallowed hard. Not directly, sir, but... There have always been whispers, a place where no one goes. The foundations are older than the theatre itself, sealed long ago. Holmes turned sharply to Orloff. Count, if Ashworth wished for Irina to disappear, truly disappear, he would not have risked taking her far. Not yet. The risk of discovery was too great. Instead, he would have chosen a place where she could remain hidden indefinitely, a prison within the very walls of her own theatre. Orloff's face was set with grim determination. "Then let us find her." Holmes nodded once. "Follow me." And with that, we descended into the depths of the opera house, into the forgotten dark where Irina Vassiliev had been left to vanish. Holmes had made many swift departures in our time together, but seldom had I seen him with such an air of urgency as we raced through the gaslit streets of London that night. The revelation of Sir Reginald Ashworth's treachery had stripped away any remaining doubts. Irina was alive, and she was still within the opera house. "Faster, Watson," Holmes urged, as our cab jostled through the narrow lanes. "We have the advantage of time, but not indefinitely. Ashworth will not leave loose ends for long." Count Orloff, seated opposite us, clenched his fists. "If harm has come to her," Holmes cut across him sharply, "then let us ensure that it has not. There will be a time for retribution, Count, but first we must act with precision. Anger clouds the mind. Logic shall see us through." The Royal Opera House loomed ahead, its grand facade eerily silent in the dead of night. The front entrance was locked, but Holmes, with his usual disregard for convention, led us through a side passage where the stagehands entered. The interior was dark, the corridors empty save for the distant sound of a lone watchman making his rounds. Holmes barely slowed his stride, leading us directly to Irina's dressing room. There, he turned to me. "Watson, light." I struck a match, and in the dim glow, I saw Holmes's sharp eyes scanning the room. He ignored the scattered costumes and personal effects, his focus singular. Then, with sudden clarity, he strode toward the large dressing mirror. "Here," he murmured. "The answer has been before us all along." Holmes ran his fingers along the ornate frame of the mirror, pressing at various points with careful deliberation. At first, nothing happened, and I feared his theory had failed. But then, with a faint click, the mirror shifted inward. "A concealed passage," I breathed. "Indeed," Holmes said. "A relic of an older structure, I suspect. This theatre was built upon a foundation far older than its present form, and men like Ashworth do not let history go to waste." Orloff wasted no time, stepping forward and pulling the mirror fully aside. Beyond it, a narrow stone passage was revealed, its air thick with damp and disuse. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, you shall take the lead with your revolver. We do not yet know what awaits us within." I nodded grimly and stepped inside, my free hand trailing the rough stone wall for balance. The passage sloped downward, winding its way beneath the theatre, until at last we reached a small iron door, rusted with age, but recently used. Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder, signaling for silence. Then, with a swift motion, he unlatched the door and pushed it open. What we saw within made my breath catch in my throat. Huddled in the corner of the dark, airless chamber, wrapped in a tattered opera cloak, was Irina Vassiliev. She did not stir at first. For a terrible moment, I feared we had come too late. But as Orloff rushed to her side, she let out a faint, shuddering breath. "Irina," Orloff murmured, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "It is over. You are safe." Her eyes fluttered open, filled with a dazed mixture of recognition and disbelief. "Victor." Holmes stepped forward, examining her with his practiced eye. "She is weak, but unharmed. Ashworth did not intend for her to die, only to disappear." I knelt beside her, pressing my fingers to her wrist. "Her pulse is steady, but she needs warmth and water at once. This place, how long has she been here?" Irina gave a faint shake of her head. "Days. I lost count." Holmes stood. "Then we waste no more time. Orloff, help her. Watson, be ready. We must make our exit swiftly. There are still those who would rather she remain lost." With great effort, Irina leaned against Orloff, her strength slowly returning. "I knew," she whispered. "I knew someone would come." Holmes allowed himself a small smile. "Then, Miss Vassiliev, you are wiser than most." With that, we left the chamber behind, ascending back toward the world above, where the final reckoning awaited. As Irena rested in Orloff's care, Holmes leaned against the chamber's cold stone wall, his arms crossed, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He had solved the puzzle, yet he seemed to take no great pleasure in it, only the measured certainty of a mind that had pursued logic to its inevitable conclusion. "You see, Watson," he began. "From the outset, this case was one of misdirection. The stage manager swore she had not left the stage. The open window suggested escape but led nowhere. And the trapdoor, though tampered with, was never actually used. Each clue led us away from the truth rather than toward it." I nodded. "Then how did you know where she was?" Holmes allowed himself a slight smile. "The answer, my dear Watson, lay not in how Irena vanished, but in why she was made to vanish." Irena stirred, her voice weak but steady. "Sir Reginald." "He knew." "Indeed," Holmes confirmed. "He discovered your secret. He feared the scandal it would bring, the ruin of his name and fortune, and so he did what all men of power do when confronted with an uncomfortable truth. He buried it." Holmes gestured around us. "These tunnels, forgotten by most, provided the perfect prison. He did not need to smuggle you away, did not need to outmaneuver Orloff or the Russian authorities. He simply needed you to disappear where no one would think to look." I exhaled. Then the whispers, the fear. Irena was looking in the wrong direction all along. "Fear clouds reason, Watson," Holmes said, "and it is in that blindness that men like Ashworth thrive. But tonight, that blindness has been lifted." By dawn, Sir Reginald Ashworth was in police custody, his protests drowned by the weight of Holmes's evidence. His empire, so carefully curated, began to crumble before him, undone by the very scandal he had sought to prevent. As for Irena, she stood by the window of our Baker Street sitting room, gazing out into the waking city. Her ordeal had left her weary, but there was still fire in her eyes. "I cannot stay," she murmured. "They will come again." Holmes inclined his head. "Then you must not allow them to find you." Count Orloff, ever watchful, stepped forward. "You will not be alone, Katya." She looked at him, hesitated, then nodded. "Number, I suppose I will not." With that, she turned to us, offering a tired but grateful smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I owe you my life." Holmes merely waved a hand. "Then live it well, Miss Vassiliev." And with that, she was gone. As the door closed behind them, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe she will ever be free of this?" Holmes considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Not entirely. But a voice like hers, Watson, was never meant to be silenced. Music, after all, is not merely sound. It is revolution." I leaned back in my chair, watching as the first light of morning filtered through the window. "And truth?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, Watson, truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to be heard." And so concluded the strangest case of the vanished opera star. The case was closed, the villain unmasked, and justice had been served. Yet as Holmes and I sat in the quiet of our Baker Street lodgings, a trace of the mystery still lingered in the air, like the final note of a song yet to fade. Holmes stood at the window, his sharp profile illuminated by the amber glow of the street lamps. He was silent for a time, watching the world beyond before he finally spoke. "You see, Watson, in the end, it was not Irena's enemies that nearly destroyed her. It was her own fear." I frowned. Fear? But surely Sir Reginald Ashworth was the true architect of this scheme. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. Ashworth merely played his part, as all men do when driven by self-preservation. But Irena, she was looking in the wrong direction all along, blinded by a ghost from her past while the real danger stood beside her, smiling. I exhaled, sinking into my chair. And yet, she survived. Holmes gave a slight nod. "Indeed." But survival is not the same as freedom. She will always be looking over her shoulder. He paused, then murmured almost to himself, "There are prisons without bars, Watson. And some are far more difficult to escape." Holmes reached for his pipe, a small smirk touching his lips. "Tell me, Watson, what do you think was Ashworth's greatest mistake? Was it underestimating Irina, overestimating himself, or failing to consider that the truth has a way of resurfacing?" I had no ready answer, and I suspect neither shall you, dear listener. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy unraveling the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, be sure to subscribe for more cases from the mind of the great detective. And if you know someone who would appreciate a mystery, share this story with them. After all, the game is ever afoot.